Roscoe,
G'day.
thanks so much for being here today, mate. I really appreciate it.
No, I'm actually really happy to pay tribute to your work too. I mean, you did a fantastic series on your enigmatic grandfather, which I think is a great untold story.
I appreciate it. I guess, well, it actually started, if I think back, when I first read In Plain Sight a few years ago.
Yeah.
I reached out to you on the section on Woomera.
I remember, and it's funny, you know, those Woomera files are fascinating. There is indisputably a long history of UAPs, UFOs, anomalous phenomena, engaging with Australia's most secret work with the British and more recently the Americans, involving testing of ICBM rockets for the delivery of nuclear weapons and also bombs, nuclear bombs, thermonuclear bombs, both at Maralinga and way, way out in the islands off WA.
Yeah, off the northwest coast there.
There were UAPs seen at all of those places. And the thing that I find fascinating is they appear in the National Archives files, and as Robert Hastings has said, there's a clear link between UAPs, anomalous phenomena, and nuclear weapons. And isn't it interesting that Australia had those experiences?
It definitely is. There's so much history there, and as you said, especially at Woomera, where there is the atomic testing. It's one thing that I've thought about in the sense that you have the attraction to nuclear, but it was also a huge site for technological innovation.
It was, and look, frankly, we still to this day don't know the whole story of what has been going on at Woomera and Maralinga. And to this day, I know there's been hypersonic missile collaboration between the United States and Australia out here in Australia. And there's been Americans participating in tests that are enclosed and still secret to this day out at, in the middle of Australia. That site has been used for well over 60 years as a test site for new, highly advanced technology. And it's a big suspicion of mine that when our colleagues like George Knapp and scallywag whistleblowers like Bob Lazar came forward in the late 1980s, it's a big suspicion of mine that a lot of what I trace in my book about what was happening in Australia, it's no coincidence that people started reporting things in the late 1980s in northwestern and southern Australia, because I think what happened was the Americans moved a lot of their operations working with advanced technology down here to Australia.
So you think there was actually specific programs based here?
I suspect that there were specific programs. I've had tips, information sort of suggested to me by people supposedly in the know. The hilarious thing is Australia is so naive about its defence relationship with the United States that we actually don't ask questions. And so one of the things that just shocked me about Northwest Cape, which is where the Australians operate at the moment, a base called the Harold E. Holt Naval Communication Station. That was first built in 1966 or so by America, and essentially the Americans operated this base pretty much solidly from the mid-60s through to 1991, when the Keating Labor government demanded that they put the base under the control of Australia. And it was a nominal transition to put it under Australian control, because it's still largely an American base. And most Australians had no idea what that base is for, and they still don't. But in the event of nuclear war, it makes northwestern Australia a prime nuclear missile target. It will be irradiated if we ever have a confrontation with a foreign adversary nation that leads to nuclear weapons being used, because that is where, that big tower at Northwest Cape is where the signals go out on a very low frequency to American nuclear attack submarines waiting in the Indian Ocean and the Southern Pacific to get orders to come. All it can do is send out a signal saying, come closer to the surface and receive the call messages to deliver your missiles to the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans or whoever it is that's attacking us. So we are integrally locked into the American nuclear strategic defence. And there's never really been any debate about it in Australia. We just glibly, as a government, agreed, tugging our forelock to our American friends back in the 60s. And what it means is we are locked into the Five Eyes alliance in a way that we don't even really understand. There's been no public debate about this in Australia. It's just done. And similarly with Pine Gap, the big base in the middle of Australia. I mean, that is essentially a ballistic missile warning site. The event of the Russians or the Chinese launching an ICBM ballistic missile, it's the place in the world where the Americans get the first alert of the launch of potentially a nuclear missile attack. And so Australia is, whether it likes it or not, integrally plugged into the US military alliance in a way that I don't think most Australians understand. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because we need big brother friends. We need an alliance to protect us, and the American alliance has done us pretty well for the last 80 years. But there hasn't really been a public debate where the public have actually had it explained to them the significance of places like Pine Gap, places like Northwest Cape, where, intriguingly, there has been a lot of anomalous UAP activity.
It's quite interesting, because even with my grandfather's story at Woomera, one of the claims he made was that he worked on a joint committee prior with the United States and Britain, while obviously the Australian operation was a joint collaboration as well. But the committee originally was between the United States and Britain, which I guess is sort of
investigating UFOs.
Investigating UFOs. That's correct. And a question I have is, if you look at the history that has led all the way through these collaborations and the United States, I guess, using Australia as sensitive military facilities and hosting these programs, are there specific facilities or programs now in these sites that you think maybe monitor or track UFOs coming in and out of the ocean, in and out of the atmosphere?
I know for a fact that the Americans are fully aware of anomalous phenomena being tracked. First time it was reported, to my knowledge, was on the DSP satellites, which are now quite old satellites. They're nearly 50 years old, some of them. And that was the downlink for the DSP program satellites came down through Pine Gap. But those satellites have now been superseded by other incredible satellites. And I am told by people in America who have worked at Pine Gap and who know about what's done at Pine Gap, which is a base near Alice Springs, near the place formerly known as Ayers Rock, now Uluru. It's slap bang in the middle of Australia, and it was put there essentially to stop the Chinese and the Russians from driving around in minivans and getting the downlinks from those satellites unencrypted, which is what they used to be. And so they were brought down into central Australia and then sent by microwave and satellite back to America. But I've been privileged enough to be given a tour of the Garden Island Defence Facility, which is a naval facility in Sydney. And because I was with a then Defence Minister, we walked through these areas that were supposedly top secret compartmentalised clearance, and people's eyes were bulging out of their heads that there was a journalist walking with the Defence Minister, but they couldn't do much about it. And I was seeing what was coming out of Pine Gap, and it was pretty mind-blowing. You know, it was literally a TV screen showing the takes from different satellites, from drones, for example, Reaper drones in Afghanistan, Middle East, in real time. And there were satellite imagery from different satellites in orbit. And what fascinates me is I'm told by people in the United States, not Australian citizens, American citizens who've been part of this program, that it is a very frequent, almost routine thing for anomalous objects to be recorded by the satellites. And not just on video. We're talking about telemetry data, infrared, tracking data, and this has been going on systematically for many, many years. What's fascinating to me is how little the Australians know. There are definitely, because I've spoken to some of them, individual Australians who, largely because of liaison, there are pilots, for example, that have flown in the Nevada test range, and they've been briefed into certain things that they might see there that they're not allowed to talk about, which ironically they've been told they're not even allowed to tell their Australian military bosses about, and they don't. And so you've got this ridiculous situation where officially, I can tell you, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Cabinet of Australia, which is our obviously executive government command, the defence minister, the intelligence community people, the bosses of those agencies have no idea what's been going on. And they're not read in to what we're talking about here. What is going on, I do believe, is there has been long going a collaboration between certain select people in the American intelligence community and certain select people occasionally in the Australian defence and intelligence community who are kind of read in, briefed in a discrete kind of a way individually as sort of trusted chaps that we can tell this story to. And I've been privileged enough to engage with people, I have to protect sources, who have conveyed to me that there is no official Australian government knowledge of this program, period. They have not been read in, which is a disgrace, really. If you think about the fact that Australia has been a loyal and some might say lickspittle ally of the United States, following it into every single war since the First World War that the US has been engaged in. You know, there are few allies in the world more loyal to the United States than Australia, and especially since the fall of Singapore in the 1940s, when Australia learned that we couldn't hang on the British Empire any longer, America became our firm ally. And that's largely been a very positive and good military alliance. But as an Australian, I find it concerning that I know things that my government doesn't know. And I've spoken to very senior people, let's say, in our government about things like the AUKUS agreement, which is an agreement where Australia is buying $368 billion Australian of Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines from the United States. And my sources in the American military are telling me that deal's never going to go ahead. There is no way it's ever going to happen, and yet we're spending already hundreds of millions of dollars on preparing for that possibility. But more importantly, if what you and I are learning in our research into UAPs is true, if it is true that the United States has a retrieval program of highly advanced non-human technology and that it's been essentially trying to reverse engineer that technology for much of the last 60 or 70 years, the implications of that are that we are being lied to as an ally of the United States. That's what worries me as a journalist, that I've seen young Australian men and women go to war and fight stupid wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and I've covered Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've seen people die, and I don't want to see that again when we know that the Americans are involved in a program that they're not revealing to one of their closest allies. That's what's at the heart of my issue with the dishonesty behind the Five Eyes Alliance, that I've actually been privileged to speak to people who have confided in me that as Australians, they know what I'm talking about. They're aware, because of their intelligence or defence background, of something that they were read into by their American friends, largely when they were working in collaboration with the Americans on other things. One that I can talk about, for example, is a Defence Department photographer from Australia who was based in Darwin, at a military base in Darwin. And this is how it works. Basically, the Americans found something in the Borneo jungle, Kalimantan. It was a craft, I'm told. The person who tells this story is a former Australian military person. The allegation is the Americans rang the Australian Defence Department and said, "Oh, can we borrow a photographer?" And this is so often the case that what happens is these Australians are sent by their Australian bosses. We're so happy to help our American friends. We don't actually ask what they're doing. The Americans just say, "Can we borrow somebody?" "Sure, yeah, you can borrow one of our photographers." So this guy's picked up by a C-130 and flown to Malaysia and then on to Kalimantan. Whereupon he is met by a team of Special Forces operatives who essentially swear him to secrecy, and he is taken to photograph the inside and outside of an alien craft recovered from the jungle. I kid you not. And this account, I know, has never been related to the Australian government, because this photographer was told by his American ally friends not to report it to the Australian government. That's how dishonest this is. And the reason I can tell you that story is because that photographer is now dead.
Okay.
And what's interesting is, to some degree, I've been able to corroborate aspects of his story in the sense that I know that there was some kind of a military operation in a particular area at a particular time. So there are things like that that I've been working on as a journalist that go to the idea that we're being played by our American cousin. Not that we don't love them to death. I love America. I'm very, very grateful for the defence alliance that we've had that has kept you and me and everybody watching this in peace for the last 60 to 80 years. We should be grateful for that. But there's a fundamental dishonesty lying at the heart of the Five Eyes Alliance right now, and only a very few people know about it. Britain knows about it. I suspect France knows about it. And I suspect Canada knows about it. But New Zealand and Australia, the junior cousins in the Five Eyes Alliance, we're being kept out of it.
In the dark.
Your grandfather knew, I suspect. And he's one of the classic illustrations of how it works. He was working with the Brits. He was on an exchange with the Brits, working in the RAF at a very, very senior level, and he was asked to participate, as you say, in a UFO investigation that was kept completely off the books. Before we did this interview, I was actually checking with my friends in the UK to see if any of those records still exist, and I noticed that all of the files from the 40s and the 50s in the British archives on UFOs have been trashed. Why?
I think they almost destroyed them in 5-year increments from what I've been able to uncover.
Yeah.
And that's quite horrifying when you think about how much history we could have probably learned from.
There's a great article that just came out from the New Paradigm Institute this week, which is an activist group in Washington, D.C., pushing for transparency. And they told the history of the cover-up. And it's quite something to actually see the history of the cover-up set out date by date by date, document by document by document. People who scoff at the idea that there's been a cover-up of the UAP mystery ignore the fact that there are documents that show that as early as 1952-53, a decision was made by the CIA to essentially lie to the public, to mislead the public about UFOs. And initially, there'd been a very great degree of openness in the US military in the late 40s. In fact, you had that press conference after the Washington, D.C. flyover, where the biggest press conference in US history was basically held in the Pentagon because the media were clamoring to know what it was that had overflown Washington, D.C. in the early 1950s. I think it was 1952. But shortly after that, a decision was made by the Defence Department to shut down public discussion of this issue. And it's been like that ever since. But what's happening now, Stephen Bassett, who's a commentator, calls it a truth embargo, and it's a great term. There is a truth embargo on UAPs, and people like myself in the media have been played for fools. We've been essentially fooled and deceived about UAPs. We've been taught to stigmatise it. But as you've discovered with your grandfather, and as I discovered when I wrote my book, there is a contrary history. There's an alternative history, a cognitive dissonance, if you like, to the whole story of UFOs that frankly has been suppressed and controlled. And that control still exists today inside our military. I'm assured by people who've been at ministerial level in our government that there is not some cover-up. You know, the Americans haven't come to the Australian government and said, I say, old chap, keep this one quiet, but we've dug up a few UFOs and, we're just working on them at the moment, and don't tell anyone, please. It really isn't the case. Australia has been kept in the dark.
I wanted to ask on that then. So there's been obviously a lot of talk about the role of private aerospace with the alleged crash retrieval program. In Australia, we do have quite a prominent role with these private aerospace contractors at areas like Woomera, where there are sensitive facilities essentially lent or leased to these contractors to use for their sort of at their own accord. And it made me wonder, do you think there is private aerospace contractors, I guess, operating or holding the UFO portfolio in Australia under an international umbrella where maybe only a few defence officials in the Australian Defence Department are brought into it, only on a need-to-know basis?
Yeah. That's exactly what's going on. Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Battelle. I mean, for a start, All three of those companies are heavily involved in what I understand is the retrieval and reverse engineering operations involving non-human tech. I just know that for a fact. It's not some belief system of mine. I just know it for a fact. I'm in touch with people who are working in the legacy retrieval reverse engineering program, and they tell me all three of those companies, well, actually Battelle's a federally funded research corporation that's part of the US government. They've all intimately been involved in the attempt to reverse engineer non-human technology for the last 80 years plus. And the interesting thing, the interesting thing is they are based in Australia. And I am told, I've not been able to verify this, but I'm talking to someone who says that they are in touch directly with a privately run group that essentially is like an umbrella organisation for these groups that are concealing the existence of this coalition. And there are Australians involved in that. One of the people I'm thinking of is a person who used to work for the Defence Signals Directorate, who has certainly passed themselves off as someone who is aware of the existence of this kind of collaboration on retrievals, and they coordinate retrievals. There are allegations that there have been retrievals in recent years in Australia involving non-human technology. I had a situation a few years back where a farmer contacted me in a particular part of Queensland, which is in the northeastern region of Australia, and that farmer told me that there were all these American left-hand drive vehicles coming out of a giant American plane that had landed nearby that were driving around the outback looking for something. And he sent me photographs of some of those vehicles. And I'm still investigating that case, but I have a feeling that there was a covert US retrieval operation that took place on Australian soil without the knowledge of anyone in the Australian government.
That's quite incredible. I'm not surprised if it is going on, though, in the sense that Australia is a massive country, and considering how it's not very populated in the centre and there's so much remote territory there, and you think about where these alleged crashes have occurred, it would make sense that if they did happen in Australia, they probably would be in these sort of in the middle of the desert, in the red territory.
I mean, somebody gave me a tip at one stage that a lot of this was run, and I don't think this is right anymore, but the suggestion was made that the foreign material exploitation program, which used to be known as the Foreign Technology Program, is a program operated and run by the Defence Intelligence Agency of the United States. And somebody suggested to me that Australia regularly contributed people to assist in the FMEP, the Foreign Material Exploitation Program, which was originally designed as a program to exploit retrieved foreign adversary technology, say MiG fighters from Russia or Chinese weaponry, North Korean weaponry. It was suggested to me that the FMEP, that Foreign Material Exploitation Program, was also being used as a cover by the Americans for the retrieval of non-human craft. I'm told that's what Australia gets told it's for when they borrow Special Forces personnel. So it's the cover that's used when the Yanks ask Australia if they can borrow some of our boys to go off and retrieve something. And this has happened. I've spoken to people in the Special Forces community who've told me they've participated in retrieval operations. And more importantly, on some occasions, they've been asked to sign non-disclosure agreements to not reveal this to their own government in Australia. So these are serving military personnel in Australia who are seconded, for example, to the British SAS in Hereford, 22 SAS, or to the Special Boat Service in the United Kingdom, and there's been European retrievals that Australians have been involved in as a result of their secondment to those operations. And knowing these guys, they're patriots, they love their country, they love Australia, but they also have a deep respect for the American alliance, and they just implicitly assume that this must be being understood at a very high level by the Australian government, because there's no way that the Americans would conspire to keep this secret from the Australian government. And when I've had the conversation with them, look, I've spoken to former prime ministers, I've spoken to former defence ministers, nobody knows about this.
Yeah.
And they're shocked because they've been told to keep quiet about it at their level on the ground as the combat soldier that's involved in these operations. And they are telling me they have been involved in the retrieval of non-human technology, period. End of story.
We've seen whistleblowers come forward in the United States about these alleged programs. Knowing that there are Australian operatives potentially involved with these, do you think that we would ever maybe see them go on the record and come forward as well?
No.
No?
No, there's a deeply inculcated distrust of news media in Australia that's almost genetic in the military. I was once at a briefing on a completely unrelated matter for officers in the Australian Army, and they weren't aware there was a journalist in the room. It was kind of a semi-public conference situation. And what struck me was the cultural attitude towards media in Australia inside the military. Officers are acculturated in the Australian media to loathe and distrust the news media. I did a story for Four Corners, which is an Australian public affairs TV show, back in 1994. That's how old I am, so that's 31 years ago. And it was a big expose into our intelligence service, ASIS. And this is important for the UFO story. And what we revealed was that Australia was doing plausibly deniable favours for the Brits particularly, but also the Americans, that were actually being kept secret from Australia, from their own spy bosses in ASIS. And so you had a situation where in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War, when Kuwait needed rebuilding after Saddam Hussein had invaded, this is the first Gulf War, there were billions of dollars of contracts up for grabs. And one of my sources was somebody in Multiplex, which is a big Australian construction company. And they told me, they said, look, we're hearing the Australian Secret Service was used to help the Brits bug the Kuwaiti government officers so that the Brits could win contracts that we were in direct competition with the Brits on. And the guy from Multiplex, who was a senior executive, said to me, where is the sense in allowing our intelligence service to be used by the Brits without us knowing about it? Because these guys were paid cash for the work they were doing. They were the best buggers in the Five Eyes Alliance. That's what we do. We're very good at bugging and technical operations, it's called. And so I discovered 31 years ago, as a young journalist working for the ABC, a public broadcaster in Australia, I discovered that there are these plausibly deniable favours that are done by defence and intelligence in Australia, where incredibly the people doing that work are actually sworn to secrecy by the American bosses or the British bosses that asked them to do it. And this is how the whole Five Eyes Alliance works with UAPs. I've been privileged to be able to speak, sometimes begrudgingly, those guys speak to me, to people who've been involved from Australia in some of these retrieval operations for the Americans and the Brits. And they're often collaborative operations between the Brits and the Americans where the Australians have been seconded to British units, for example, and then brought in as special operators to assist in a retrieval. And the thing that fascinates me is I've spoken to very senior people in the government, both in secretarial level in the government departments responsible, or to the political representatives, the ministers that should have had responsibility for that portfolio. And it's very sensitive to do that because obviously what we're doing is we're talking about top secret issues. So I have to be careful what I'm talking about and when and what period. But suffice to say, none of these people knew about these operations. This is why, to get to the truth of what's been going on with the UAP subject, a lot of this is run through the CIA, through an office that used to be called the Office of Global Access, but they keep on changing its name because we discovered its name. And the OGA of the CIA has essentially been coordinating the cover-up on UFOs for much of the last 30, 40 years. And it's been part of a deliberate and concerted operation to keep all of this within a very select need-to-know cadre of people inside joint special operations. And even the comms are kept secure from the normal special operations comms. There are entirely different communications channels, entirely different bearers on the satellites. This is something that's been locked down for years. And yes, it's coordinated through the big defense aerospace companies in America. And I suspect what happened out of a misguided sense in the 1970s under Nixon, that this was going to be compromised by FOI and that Congress couldn't be trusted. And this was very much a vestigial remnant of the Nixon administration having deep distrust of openness and accountability after the Watergate revelations. It's been put to me that President Nixon, in particular, mandated the transfer of a lot of this technology from the control of the Department of Energy, where it was being kept secret as a nuclear secret, and that essentially it was put into and divested into the control of certain private aerospace companies. And so what's really cool now is you've got big tech, Silicon Valley. They're pissed that they're not part of this.
Been cut out.
They're not interested in disclosure. They're just upset that they're not being read into the same thing. And so you had an effort a few years ago with Lockheed Martin attempting to hand over one of the craft that they have in their possession to Bigelow Aerospace. Yeah. And different people from Bigelow Aerospace have admitted that this is the case, that there was going to be a transfer of technology, highly advanced, exotic technology, that's the euphemism, to Bigelow Aerospace. And guess who intervened to stop that?
CIA.
The CIA Office of Global Access. And so what you've got here is a fear within the CIA that they were going to lose control of this great crown jewel, this secret. The problem is, none of this would be a problem if it had all been properly done, if Congress had been read in, if the Gang of Eight had been read in as they're meant to be. There's a group of 8 people in the Congress where if there's a really, really sensitive secret, you don't have to tell Congress, you don't even have to tell the committees. All you have to do is read in 8 people in Congress who are allowed to be read in to the darkest secrets of all. And I know they haven't been. I mean, Senator Warner this week admitted that he hadn't become aware of the Immaculate Constellation program that's been alleged by Matthew Brown to be one of the legacy programs, special access programs that are part of this secret. And if Senator Warner doesn't know, that's a real worry. Who does know? And why is it being kept secret from Congress? What I understand is that there's an executive order that was made by probably Eisenhower, but possibly earlier even under the Truman administration, where essentially it was decided, arrogantly, in an era of the Cold War, that this should be kept secret even from Congress, which is a breach of the US Constitution, period.
Do you think that it was kept secret because of the Cold War, with the idea that maybe if they admitted UFOs were real, there could be the possibility that the Russians or the Soviets would take advantage and maybe disguise a UFO as a nuclear bomber or missile?
I can tell you that's still a concern today, and it's a legitimate concern. We do not want the Chinese or the Russians or the North Koreans, for that matter, or the Iranians securing an advantage over us on exotic technologies like retrieved non-human technology. It would be a nightmare. But I can tell you, the people that I've spoken to inside the Legacy program are genuinely concerned that the over-secrecy, the excessive secrecy attached to the Legacy program, is confounding our ability to get the breakthroughs in this technology that the Chinese and the Russians are working on contemporaneously.
Hindering us.
And as David Grush, when he went public, said to me in June 2023, this is why David went public, because there's been a Cold War going on now for years between the Chinese, the Russians and the Americans over control of these highly advanced technologies. And we're realizing we're falling behind. And the worst thing of all is what is being warned about by different whistleblowers, that we now have a situation where there is essentially a cabal that regards itself above government, above sovereign government. A cabal that was given control of this technology 50, 60, 70 years ago in the private sector, and which takes the view, as commercial entities do, that because they've spent a lot of money on it, non-public money, not taxpayer money, but shareholder money, in addition to the shareholder money that's been spent on it, they have the right to treat that technology as their own, and we don't have the right to know about it. And it's a very interesting situation that we have a potential for literally a deep state.
Yeah.
What Trump has been warning about actually exists. I always thought it was a nonsense, but I'm told there is a deep state, that there is a group of companies, individuals that regard themselves as completely above the accountability controls of Congress, and who may feel that because this is done with nominal oversight from people in the defence and intelligence community and under an executive order of the president, they may feel that it's legal. But I'm told it's not. And the interesting thing is, if there are highly advanced technologies, energy systems, propulsion systems that are being kept secret from the public, why are we not allowed to know about that? And there have been extremely strong hints coming from the new Trump administration, from the Science and Technology Office of the Trump Executive Office, suggesting that there are technologies not known about. Trump's dropped dozens of hints that there is a weapon that we have not yet revealed the existence of, which is an absolute game changer for the Americans in terms of dealing with foreign adversaries. A lot of people are telling me that the technology behind the Golden Dome, which has been announced just in the last week or so by the Trump administration, that what is known about existing weapons technologies cannot be explained by what is being proposed in the Golden Dome technologies. Is the Golden Dome an attempt to bring into the public domain technologies that have previously been kept in the private domain with NHI technologies? We just don't know because the public aren't being told. And yet there is a multi-$100 billion decision being made by the Congress and by the Defence Department to buy into this program, and the public's not being told that this may in fact have come through, at least in part, non-human technology that was acquired by the US 80, 90 years ago.
Reverse engineering. Eric Davis, the American physicist who works in aerospace and some of the UFO programs, has stated that we actually may not have cracked reverse engineering. From his words, there's clearly a lot of mixed messaging coming out of the States, with some people believing that we do have craft that are fully functional, have been reverse engineered. What do you think, if we're hearing all this noise that the United States maybe does have advanced technologies, do you think that maybe we've cracked certain elements of science or physics, but we don't have functional craft?
There's been materials science breakthroughs. I mean, the best example I can think of is the Michael Herrera story. Mm-hmm. So he's a US Marine who says that he was deployed as part of a relief operation in Java in a certain period in the early 2000s. And that in the course of a deployment on the ground, he and his small unit were overwhelmed by black paramilitary-clad soldiers who were clearly American, who basically threatened to kill them, and that in the course of that deployment, they saw what was clearly a US reverse-engineered craft. It had seams. It was clearly human-made, terrestrial-made. You know, I don't know how you delineate between non-human technology and terrestrial technology, but he had the impression that this was something that the US had built and was knowingly operating. And I've heard countless such stories now from people inside the legacy program, that there are aspects of technology that we have been able to replicate. But as one individual who was the former US Navy head of essentially research and development, science and technology development, Nat Kobitz, told me, he was dying of cancer, and he confided in me while I was writing my book that he had been read into the legacy retrieval and reverse engineering program. And he was asked at one stage to look at what looked like the bulkhead from a crashed craft of some kind. And he was taken literally underground at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is the apocryphal location for a lot of this technology.
The Blue Room.
And he was shown this very lightweight piece of metal. And he said that when he was allowed to examine it, it was clear to him that it was non-human, because it was constructed at the atomic level using materials science techniques that we haven't even learned yet. That it was essentially constructed three-dimensionally with different types of metals bonded in a way that he couldn't even understand how they were bonded. And that was the revelation for him as someone at the highest levels in the US Navy, responsible for research and development, who was never allowed to actually go and see these craft. So there's obviously a parallel secret operation going on, and I'm pretty confident I know some of the locations where this is happening, where the United States has private aerospace contractor friends who are in secret largely running this retrieval and reverse engineering program separate from the US government. But when they need military might to do these operations, they deploy joint special operations teams. And guess what? Jake Barber, who I interviewed in January this year, is one of those people, who was essentially a CIA NOC, non-official cover intelligence operative, who essentially operated under deep cover through Northrop Grumman and who basically was involved in retrievals. And the interesting thing is, why are people surprised that this is how it's done? There's a long history, as I've explained to you, of plausibly deniable use of people in the Five Eyes Alliance, not just Americans, to do these recovery operations. And it's very much part of the pride and military ethos of these special operations operators that they don't talk about what they do.
So if there is a cabal that has this alleged reverse engineered technology and they're utilizing it for their own means, does that then mean that they essentially could have things or agendas that are outside the government's means to be able to control the defense department?
You're inviting me to speculate, but yes. I mean, what is the risk to international government's sovereignty? My government has been tacitly assisting a UAP retrieval and reverse engineering program operated by our closest ally, the United States, for probably 60 years without realizing it. And it has a direct bearing on the equipment that we decide to buy in our multi-billion-dollar defense budget. It has a direct bearing in what we know or don't know going into a potential war with China. Or say there's an incursion in the Middle East and we decide to get involved in helping the Americans take out the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Because this is the issue. However we like it or not, we are hardwired in Australia into the US Defence Alliance. We can't exclude ourselves because there are bases in Australia that are integral to the information gathering that allows America to carry out its wars. They cannot launch an attack on Iran without going through Australia. That's why Pine Gap matters. And the interesting thing is, I would have thought that a defence ally that is that locked in to that alliance would have the right to know about what we're talking about here. Mm. And to me, that's the issue that matters to me, that it's great, it's fantastic if we've recovered this technology. If we have these systems, these propulsion systems, these energy systems, I would much prefer that it's the Americans rather than the Russians or the Chinese. God help us if authoritarian regimes gain control of the weaponry that I understand lies behind the implications of this technology. What is an issue is that the US Congress doesn't know about this, period. They've been lied to successively for decades. And governments like Australia and New Zealand and sections of the Canadian government don't know about this either. Now that's disturbing. There needs to be a level of transparency at the Five Eyes governmental level where intelligence chiefs, defence chiefs and politicians are briefed in. I'd be happy with that. And I've actually sought an undertaking from people who I know in defence contractors in the United States. I've said, look, why don't you just put this on a legal footing? I actually had a conversation with somebody from a defence contractor in the United States who rang me out of the blue. And I said, how did you get my number? And he said, how do you think? And we had a conversation about what they should do. And they told me that the secrecy is not being manipulated by them, it's being manipulated by the CIA. Yeah. And I think a large part of this is individuals in the US intelligence community who have taken it upon themselves with hubris and arrogance to dictate that the public can't deal with this information, which I think is rubbish. I think if the public was told tomorrow that there's a non-human intelligence engaging with this planet and that we've retrieved technology, I think most kids would just shrug their shoulders and go, yeah, sure, okay, great, fantastic.
I think we'd be able to handle it.
Yeah, I'm sure we would.
I think, yeah.
But the thing that I think is happening is there's a certain A-type male personality inside government that one sees a strategic military advantage that's totally misconceived in keeping this secret. Because the materials scientists, some of whom I've spoken to in the legacy program, they tell me we are now at a disadvantage compared with the Chinese and the Russians, who they believe are actually gaining an advantage over us in things like plasma technology, energy technology and propulsion systems derived from this non-human tech. They think that we're at a disadvantage because what they're saying is needed is something like a Manhattan Project, which was kept secret, of course, from the American people during the war and the rest of the world. But they're saying that the excessive compartmentalization and secrecy that has been attached to this program has stopped the breakthroughs that we should be making. And we all want America to make those breakthroughs. Good heavens, I'm a believer in Space Force and Stargate, and I want my kids and my grandkids to be going out into the universe with a country that is democratic and believes in freedom and ideals, not countries that are borderline fascist and authoritarian like China and Russia. So yeah, we are involved in a Cold War here, but what needs to happen is we need to put it onto a footing where it's accountable and it's transparent. And I don't think, one of the arguments that's been made to me is that if we reveal, Ross, the existence of a non-human intelligence, and I've had conversations with people in the US government like this, and they say, look, you're saying we should just reveal the existence of NHI. And I'm going, yeah, sure, you should. Stop lying to the public. The more you lie, the more you dig yourself in a hole. And they're saying, but yeah, it becomes a slippery slope though, that if we reveal that, then people will say, well, what about the technology you've recovered? And I said, well, get President Trump to stand up at a podium and say, yes, we have recovered technology, and so have the Russians, and so have the Chinese, and we're buggered if we're going to tell you what we've got.
My only fear is that maybe with some of these private aerospace contractors and people involved with these reverse engineering technologies from UFOs is that maybe they would, once they reach a certain point and they can actually put it out to the public, they would say that it is all man-made, and they would use it to potentially discredit or say that NHI never really had any role to kill the momentum that has been building.
Well, that's what's pushing the big drive from Silicon Valley. I mean, it's why people like, for example, Palantir's Peter Thiel, some of the Google executives are taking a really close interest in the allegations of claims that there's been recovered NHI tech. I've spoken to some of these high net worth individuals privately, and they're telling me they're really interested to know the truth. And the reason why is because they're publicly listed companies too. And they're worried that just because of a coincidence that they didn't exist 50 years ago when a lot of this stuff was gifted to private aerospace, they're worried they're at a commercial disadvantage. Why should Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, why should these companies get an advantage over newer companies which arguably have much more clever expertise with high-end materials science? I mean, the world of exotic microchip design, micro design, isn't a speciality of the US defense aerospace industry. They are dependent on Silicon Valley for that expertise. And don't you see what's happened? What's happened is the big impetus for UAP disclosure, it's not coming from Congress, it's not coming from you or me doing our podcasts or doing media. It's coming from the big end of town in Silicon Valley, who are beginning to realise they've been left out of the party, and they want in.
Well, that almost leads to Skywatcher, doesn't it, with the private investment going into that. And I guess for people that don't know, yeah, Skywatcher is a private company that's funded by Silicon Valley essentially to try and, capture proof or evidence of UFOs, but also, unidentified aircraft. And that leads me to ask, do you think that there's maybe a concern with, say, Silicon Valley getting involved and creating Skywatcher, that those that program or that company could be absorbed by the black world and be classified just like other UFO programs in the past as well?
My big worry for Skywatcher is that it might accept a juicy contract. I mean, if I was the Defence Department, knowing that Skywatcher is essentially funded by private equity, and I think there's probably quite a few $1 million already that's gone into doing the work that they're doing, and it's laudable work. I mean, James Fowler, who's part of Skywatcher with Jake Barber, he did an interview with Jesse Michaels recently where he described some absolutely amazing results. And he actually acknowledged that there were people inside the US government who acknowledged that what they were being shown by Skywatcher was very probably non-human. So the implications of this are that Skywatcher is uncovering stuff that probably the US Defence Department doesn't want uncovered. And my brooding nightmare about Skywatcher is it's run by good people. James and Jake are friends, they're good guys, and they're genuinely interested in transparency. But the money men behind them, they're obviously keen to get contracts. They're keen to demonstrate the utility of what they're doing. So let's hope that they're not tied up with a juicy contract from the Defence Department that offers them, $50 million to go away and do UAP observations for, maybe Arrow or the Defence Department. And if that happened, this is all totally hypothetical, what kind of NDAs or secrecy agreements would they be tied up in as a result of that?
Exactly, yeah. And then it just disappears like other UFO programs in the past.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Let's hope they're good people and that they continue doing and showing the transparency they've been showing to date.
Yeah, I hope so too. The financial incentive, I guess, is always raises ethical questions. And, with Skywatcher, they're clearly using a different means which hasn't been disclosed before. They secret source, they call it, in the sense of how they use the electromechanical signaling to call these UFOs, essentially to try and interact with them. Do they understand what the electromechanical signal is that they're using means to the NHI that they're potentially interacting with? Like, is it a SOS? Is it a threat or even a mating call? I'm not sure.
You'd have to ask them.
Okay, so don't.
They're very, very secretive about their dog whistle. Although I have a pretty good idea what the dog whistle involves, and there are other people telling me that they can replicate the dog whistle. And I'd certainly like to run an experiment where we can try and do that in a more transparent way. I mean, I'm a bit disappointed with Skywatcher at the moment because at the moment they're controlling media access. Like they're filming with their own cameras on location. They're not giving media access to the location, which I can kind of understand, because they might inadvertently, for example, film something that's national security sensitive. I mean, say the US has got an Aurora aircraft and their detection systems pick up some super advanced stealth technology aircraft that hasn't been revealed yet. Nobody wants that to be revealed. And so there are national security implications behind a detection system for UAPs that, as boring as it sounds for me as a journalist, we have to respect. I don't want foreign adversaries gaining an advantage over the US, which is at the apex in the world of breakthrough aerospace technology. So there are reasons why you might want to keep it secret. But there are risks involved in this. I've forgotten the thread of your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Well, that kind of can go on to the next point about there's been a lot of talk about the idea of, interacting. Jake Barber has spoken about this idea of the feminine energy from NHI that he has experienced. And that this idea that NHI might be good and that it's sort of, altruistic and maybe...
Well, I noticed Whitley Strieber, who's one of the most well-known experiences in the world. He's written that book, Communion, which had the grey alien face on the
Classic.
front. Whitley came out recently and said that he felt that Jake was unwittingly being deceived by whatever the phenomenon was that he engaged with when he was carrying that egg craft in his helicopter. And he thinks that the feminine divine impression of love and joy that he received was essentially a manipulation by whatever entity it was in charge of that machine. And strictly speaking, I haven't spoken to Jake in detail about this, but maybe he's right. We just don't know. And there's a lot we don't know about this. And one of the implications to me that I think is incredibly profound is what's called Slide 9.
Yes.
So Slide 9 is essentially a PowerPoint slide from a presentation to an Undersecretary of Defence that was made during, I think, the ATIP program research into UAPs that was going on behalf of the Defence Intelligence Agency when there was a UFO investigation prior to the ARO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. And in that PowerPoint slide briefing, there was one slide that is just mind-blowing in its implications. Because essentially, it suggests that the phenomenon, whatever it is, has the power to cognitively and physically manipulate the environment, that it can manipulate human perception, that it can make us see things that aren't real. So we really are at a point where if there is a phenomenon that can manipulate human perception, how can we be sure of anything that we're seeing? Even if we're seeing something on radar and it's looking like a craft or a jellyfish or whatever we're describing, how do we know that's not something that's manipulating our sensor systems? Because that's exactly what slide 9 advised the Defence Department this phenomenon can do. And James Fowler, who's one of the principals of Skywatcher, in the interview with Jesse Michaels just this week, he has described the phenomenon remotely using some kind of electromagnetic energy to shut down his sensor systems.
Interference, yeah.
So you have remote sensor disassembly, I think is the term from slide 9. What was once fiction is now quantum science. And I think we're at a cutting edge now in the realization that the phenomenon, whatever it is, the least likely explanation is that it's extraterrestrial. That would actually be quite boring, just an alien from another planet. I mean, I take it for granted that there are aliens from another planet, even though most people on this planet still exclude that as a serious possibility. What I think is interesting is that most people I talk to describe these entities, these intelligences, as something interdimensional. And that the implications of that are immense. And I think the US is only now coming to terms. Yes, it's recovered technology, but it's only now coming to terms with the broader scientific implications and the implications for quantum science in particular, behind the idea of a multidimensional universe and the idea that whatever this is, it's something interdimensional or perhaps intraterrestrial. Maybe it's always been here. Maybe it's been sharing this planet with us. Maybe it created us. Maybe it's nurturing our development, but it doesn't want to be discovered. And now we're learning, using sensor systems we've never used before, how to perhaps detect these technologies. And I think that one of the most sinister things that Skywatcher is discovering is that whatever this phenomenon is, it's conducting ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. And we can't exclude the possibility, albeit I suspect remote, that this is something malevolent or ill-intentioned. That's why we need to take this seriously.
I agree.
And you now have on the record US government officials in their droves admitting this is a real phenomenon. But we still have this cognitive dissonance with a large part of the public and the mainstream media, which is playing catch up to something that the US has already admitted is real. And the biggest worry I have when I talk to people isn't what they know, it's what they don't know.
I think the possibilities appear to be limitless at this point with how ambiguous the data is. And from the circumstantial evidence that we have, I think one thing which we can say about the phenomenon or NHI, the way that we interpret it, is that there's one consistent theme through its behavior, and that it's deceptive. And that it has an element of trickery. And I almost think, the way that we sort of make associations with nuclear energy and these sites, we could even go as far to say that maybe that's actually potentially doing that as a form of deception or distraction to make it seem like it actually means something, when its real agenda or intention could be far more complex and beyond our means of understanding.
One thing for sure, it underlines why this needs to be acknowledged and studied. The secrecy is obfuscating human understanding of what I think is the most important secret in the universe right now.
Are we alone?
Yeah. It's amazing. And I think it also goes on to help us answer those questions, what happens to us after we die?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's definitely a spiritual link to whatever this phenomenon is. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable about that, but here's one question that's quite fun. It's often been mocked that there is this Collins elite, so-called, inside the Pentagon, who warn, as evangelical Christians, that whatever this is something evil. And they use the words demonic. And I've had conversations with people in the US Air Force where they say, look, this is evil. We know we can't go there because it's bad, it's evil, it's demonic. And I'm saying, I had an argument with one guy quite senior in the US Air Force where I said to him, you're letting your Christian ideas intrude on a scientific understanding of a phenomenon. And he said, Ross, I know this is demonic. We shouldn't be having anything to do with it. How do I know they're wrong?
Well, we don't. I guess that's the thing. We don't. But also, that putting a religious connotation on something maybe so profound is limiting the exploration of what it really could be.
Absolutely.
And I think that's also, I consider it a little bit lazy.
It is lazy.
Yeah.
No, I completely agree with you. And my feeling is, I was acculturated as a young kid in religious schooling, and nothing makes you more irreligious than being forced as a little boy to go to church every day.
Yes.
And I used to get so annoyed about having to pray to the God fairy when my teachers at school said we had to say our prayers at night and all of this sort of stuff. And it acculturated me against religion, deep ingrained suspicion of religion. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the Vatican Church almost certainly knows about the phenomenon and has been recording it and observing it for, I suspect, possibly even 1,000 years. But there's a cover-up. And there's a colluded cover-up. The Vatican was involved, allegedly, according to David Grush, in the retrieval of the Magenta craft that was passed through the OSS to the US Air Force in 1944. So you've got religious institutions involved in this cover-up. Why? And I guess there is one data point that does worry me. David Grush did talk about agreements. And he wouldn't go into a lot of detail when I pushed him on it really hard in my interview with him. And I'm the only one that's ever had the opportunity to ask him about it. Because I noticed in his DOPSA, he was authorised to talk about agreements. And so I pushed him really hard on it, much more so than he probably wanted to be. And it's clear, the implication to me is that if what David's saying is correct, there are sections of the US government that have concluded agreements of some kind with non-human intelligence, which is mind-blowing if true. And the implication of that is it part of those agreements, do you think?
For the secrecy.
For the secrecy.
That leads to the question, is the phenomena as in charge with secrecy as we believe also, the government to be?
If we did make agreements, who did we make agreements with?
Yeah.
And are they the good guys?
What's good, I guess.
No, but that's the really interesting thing is, one hint I got was that we made agreements, or that sections of the US government, particularly the US Air Force, unilaterally and without any congressional approval, which is normally meant to happen when you make international agreements, they secured an agreement with allegedly a non-human intelligence that might not be friendly. And that's the allegation. It's not something I can even begin to investigate. But is that the issue that lies at the heart of the secrecy behind all of this? That essentially there's this dirty little secret tucked away in the cupboard inside the CIA that they just can't begin to even acknowledge. And hidden in there also is the secret of the JFK assassination, which I suspect also has a UFO link. And all of these dirty secrets are just being pushed back into the darkest recesses of that cupboard in the CIA because nobody wants to begin to acknowledge this. I think there's a group of self-interested people who are hindering public understanding of the biggest secret in human history purely and simply because they're covering their asses.
Yeah, they're afraid for being punished for everything that's happened in the past. What do you think UFOs are. Do you actually think it's a technology, or do you think there are elements that are etheric? Because we hear, I think without question, there is this sort of parapsychological component or paranormal aspect to UFOs that we don't have a means to explain.
Your speculation is as good as mine, Rhys. I mean, I honestly, anything I say is totally speculative based on source data. I don't know for sure. What I can tell you is that people who work on this technology tell me it has no control systems, no control surfaces, no visible propulsion system, no dials, no levers, no buttons. It's a shell. They tell me it's operated by consciousness. Go figure. So, are these genuine technology? Well, yes, in the sense that they're some kind of constructed object, craft. But are they technology as you and I understand it? I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. And that's the other thing is, if we're involved, as I know we are, in summoning, and I mean, Jake Barber's effectively admitted this, that he and his team on the range were involved in summoning non-human craft. And it's clear, the implication is that microwave pulse weapons, high beam microwave pulse weapons, were being used to down these craft. So whatever they are, we've acted offensively against a highly advanced non-human intelligence on behalf of the human race.
Our first contact is essentially engaging with war.
Yeah. So thanks very much, America. You know, whoever you are in the program that made these decisions to engage with these HPM weapons, you've made it very clear your position. And the interesting thing is, was the emotion that Jake was feeling after he was retrieving that craft, was that his emotion? Or was it the emotion of the entity inside the craft or attached to that craft, feeling a great sense of despondency and disappointment that this is how these primitive apes respond when they try and engage with us humans?
Well, I guess that idea has almost been spoken about, that maybe the reason the phenomenon hasn't disclosed itself is because we haven't reached a point potentially of conscious evolution where we're evolved or mature enough to engage in an enlightened way, which maybe they operate on.
It's funny, I spent a large part of my career as a journalist covering shitty little wars that Australia has found itself in, largely because of misguided foreign policy inside the United States. Iraq, Afghanistan notably. And whatever one says, both of those wars were a terrible mistake. They were driven by a completely deluded, false notion about what was a really good idea for the US in terms of fighting Islamist terrorism. I worry that our warlike nature, we're just not ready. We're primitive apes. And I'm kind of despondent at the moment about the likelihood of any meaningful move by government to make a disclosure. What I hope, and I genuinely hope this, is that the NHI, which I know to be real, manifest themselves. Because I think the moment that we humans become aware of ourselves, not as Australians or Russians or Americans or Chinese, the moment that we start thinking of ourselves as genuinely humans, human beings in an intelligent universe where there are multiple intelligent species, where we are just one species knowing that there are vastly advanced technologies way ahead of ours. The moment that we are humbled by that knowledge, I think, is the moment that we become truly human. And I have a theory, it's a working hypothesis. Ever since I started talking about how there are, and I'm going to be talking about this at Contact in the Desert, I let slip that I had a few friends who were being downloaded to incredible ideas, you know, going to bed, having a dream about alien beings and ideas, and then waking up with these incredible ideas in their head, just crammed with knowledge. And what happened was incredible. The reason I'm getting tens of thousands of emails a month is because that struck a nerve. People are watching my show and responding to that and telling me that they're getting downloads. And there is a question mark in my mind that maybe what's happening is the NHI don't see much point in engaging with government. I mean, all the government does is shoot at them. You know, they're appealing to the best of us through direct contact. And I don't know how they do it, but essentially there's a growing degree of evidence that human consciousness may be non-local, that essentially ideas like telepathy, remote viewing, astral travelling, some kind of ability to connect with an external, which is what the psionics are allegedly doing for Skywatcher, for example, and which the US has been secretly researching for the last 60 or 70 years. I think what we're talking about here is much, much bigger than just extraterrestrials or interdimensionals. What we're talking about here is a new understanding of what we are as humans. And that maybe what we are is we're part of an uber consciousness, and that there's a purpose for us here on this planet, that somehow our souls or whatever we are, our being gains something from the experiences that we have on this planet. And I can't help but be humbled by the apparent benevolence of whatever kind of non-human intelligence it is that's engaging with us, because we are a bunch of primitive, stupid, warlike apes. I mean, look at us. You know, we're having trench warfare in 2025 in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. Trench warfare, 100 years after the First World War.
We're a primitive species with technology,
Yeah.
really.
We're a bunch of stupid monkeys that haven't reconciled the clash between our reptilian limbic brain and the more modern neocortex. And there's a mystery in that, by the way. Why do we have two different types of brain? What happened 300,000-400,000 years ago? Are we a genetic experiment that went bad? And are our creators lifting their hands up in the air going, oh, for God's sake, what did we do? Should we put these guys out of their misery, or are we just going to let them blow themselves up?
I think that's why the UFO topic is so fascinating and compelling for people, that once they realize there is something to this, it starts to go at the heart of these questions, like our identity. Where did we come from?
Sure.
Who are we? Are we alone? What happens after we die?
I don't know why everybody isn't interested in UFOs. You should be. It's the fundamental questions of our existence. Are we alone? And what happens to us after we die?
Sometimes I wonder if there's almost a block for people, in the sense that it's such a big question with such profound ramifications if we dive into it, that maybe people are too caught up in their day-to-day with rent, families, jobs, that's just something that requires too much headspace.
Yeah.
Because I myself, you know, when I look into this subject and I speak to other people about it, it's one of the most intoxicating topics you can possibly discuss.
And it's not just a boy thing. I mean, I get some women saying to me, oh, you boys, you know, your UFO obsession. I get a lot of women, and they're very interested in the spiritual ideas. And I think it's really interesting that this is not a gender-driven thing. It's not a first world thing. The volume, I have never, as a journalist in my career, I mean, I've done true crime stories and big investigations. I have never had a response like I've had to this story. It's beyond journalism. It's touching something fundamental. And I'm humbled and honoured to be part of this investigation. I don't truly know whether I'm ever going to get the answer, but as you say, it's a rollicking, fun ride. I mean, it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Why wouldn't we be interested in the idea of us not being alone in the universe? Why wouldn't we be interested in the idea of what we humans are here for on this planet, our fundamental purpose as human beings? And why is this kind of default giggle? I mean, Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, was interviewed just recently, and Fox News did this simpering interview with him on the grass outside the Pentagon. And they asked him about UFOs. And they just did, I mean, it was almost the usual X-Files swell rose, and you were left with this kind of Pete Hegseth saying, no, I haven't briefed myself on Area 51 or aliens. Why the hell not? I mean, we know for a fact that the US has acknowledged this is a genuine mystery. We know as recently as this week that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, has admitted that a jet fighter had a collision with a UAP causing serious damage, grounding the aircraft. There are multiple such incidents where national security and flight safety concerns are being raised about these incursions by whatever these objects are. This is a national security, public safety issue. Government is aware of it. Very senior people in the Pentagon have admitted this cannot be dismissed as nonsense. And yet the quality or the paucity of mainstream media of the coverage of this issue is just appalling. It's reprehensible. And I think a reckoning will come in 10 or 15 years' time when we finally do know the truth. Probably because the NHI have actually forced it to become public.
That leads me to ask, there's been so much discussion of this date, 2027, and where the source of the information comes from, we don't know. But there have been some prominent spokespeople who have been involved with the UFO topic that have spoken about this date. Do you know if there's any validity to that source of that information? And if so, what is your interpretation of that date, if it means anything?
There's certainly something going to happen in 2027, and I don't know what it is.
Okay.
I've also heard 2034, and I've also heard other dates, much later. But depends who you talk to. Some people say it's a pole reversal. Some people say it's an asteroid hitting the planet. Some people say it's AI reaching quantum, and then all of a sudden we lose the capacity to have control of our own computer systems. I have no idea. What I am aware of is that everybody's telling me we're on borrowed time. And I cannot begin to emphasize how serious a look I get when I say to people who are confiding in me, what's the timescale on this? And they're urging me to be urgent. They're saying to me, people need the right to know this. They have a right to know this. And I'm going, well, what are we talking about? And I feel like shaking these people and saying, for God's sake, just bloody tell me. And they are all constrained by their national security oaths. They want the public to know this. And this is why the President Trump, has a unique ability to literally flick a switch and force this to be revealed. And look, that might still happen. You've got Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, Director of National Intelligence. You've got Nash Patel at the FBI. You've got John Ratcliffe at the CIA. 3 people who have all, prior to coming into government, expressed strong interest and support for UAP disclosure. Well, let's hold their feet to the fire and see what they're prepared to reveal. At the moment, I'm not seeing a great deal.
Yeah, because the only thing that Trump hasn't signed is an executive order for the declassification of
So what have they
UFO
told
info.
him? I mean, I did an interview with Don Trump Jr. in December, and I can tell you, he's red hot on the subject.
Yeah.
He's very, very interested in UAPs. Why is his old man very evasive on the issue of UAPs? What has he been told? Like, what do they do to the presidents? Do they bring them in? And what's that thing that they use in that UFO film where they hold
the neuralizer?
The neuralizer. Have they neuralized the president? That's what worries me. Basically, what do they tell these people? And it's only a hypothesis on my part, but here's Trump comes out this week and he announces a golden dome I'm told that on known science, the Golden Dome is technically unachievable on known technical science. Yes, we can do what we've done to help Israel defend itself in that sort of area, but the notion of a nationwide dome that can stop intercontinental ballistic missiles or incoming missiles, the experts say to me that's just not possible within the science they know. So is this, as you suggested earlier, the beginning of an attempt to inculcate or insert NHI technology into known human science? Is this going to be the beginning of a technology transfer? And is that the way they want to do it? They don't want to have to reveal that they've got these craft, but what they want to do is slowly insinuate this technology into the US arsenal. And are they sitting, as Trump has indicated many times, on a superweapon? And interestingly enough, just for everybody's observation, Putin has said the same thing, and so have senior people in the Politburo. The Russians have indicated they're sitting on a superweapon, and people are getting into my ear about a weapon that I'm told officially is fictional, but which I'm told is real, and they're scalar weapons, which make allegedly thermonuclear weapons look like children's toys.
Just in case thermonuclear weapons weren't enough to destroy the Earth, we should use something else more powerful. So on April 6, 1966, we had the Westall incident here in Australia, which was a mass sighting over a school. There was clearly a cover-up in the sense that there was massive military involvement. There is zero documentation that's able to be tracked. What do you think happened there, and do you think that incident will ever be resolved?
It's funny because a good friend of mine, Keith Basterfield, has suggested that it was just a balloon, and we can assume that it was just an inadvertent stray balloon that strolled in from an American operation. And I just don't think that's true at all. I honestly think this was something anomalous. And what really persuaded me of this was Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher at the school, who was in the playground with these hundreds of kids, many of whom I've spoken to. And he saw with his own eyes these two, maybe three, he's not sure, elliptical metallic discs hovering over the playground in broad daylight. And Andrew described seeing what these kids also described, which is seeing one of these objects then descend down into the Grange. And he and other teachers were yelling at these kids not to jump over the fence, but of course some of them did. And some of the kids that did jump over the fence and went really close to this object describe irrefutably a constructed mechanical object, not a balloon. You know. And to this day, all of those people, some of whom are now in their late 60s, are adamant that what they experienced was some kind of alien spacecraft. What was the most telling part of the story for me was what happened to Andrew Greenwood later that week after he'd spoken publicly, I think to local media, about what he'd seen. And he gets a knock on his door, and he's a young teacher at a school, starting out as a young teacher. This is the mid-1960s. And standing on his doorstep, there's one guy in uniform, he's an Australian military official, and there's another guy in civilian clothes. And they basically threaten him. And they say, if you don't shut up about this, you will not work as a teacher. It will become known that you are an alcoholic, which was a total lie. And they were basically threatening him to shut the hell up about it. And one of the things I've done a lot of in my career is sit down with people who have secrets that they have a great difficulty talking about because it's the first time they've really spoken about it. Andrew was like that. It was a huge decision for him to go on camera with me for the first time and speak publicly about what happened to him, because all his life, for 60 years, he'd been threatened by these pricks that turned up on his doorstep. And then one thing I haven't spoken a lot about publicly is I then got a contact phone call from somebody I've known from a very long time, somebody who was in a very senior role in the Australian Federal Police. And that person, when they were a child, a young boy, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, I can't remember exactly how old they were, their dad was very senior in civil aviation in Australia. And it turned out his father is the guy who wrote the secret investigation report for the then Department of Supply, which was an external organisation that ran the whole Maralinga and Woomera operation and did all the UFO investigations.
I know it well.
His father was the Civil Aviation Authority figure who essentially investigated the Westall incident. And he remembered in great detail his father getting picked up in a government car, and it was all very hush-hush and secret, and then being taken to the Westall school for 3 or 4 days in a row. And he also remembered his mother and father having hushed conversations about how there was a copy of the report that had been kept in the house, and his father was really worried about it because he'd kept a copy of the report. And for a moment I was thinking, oh my God, we could find a copy of this report. And it turns out that his mother destroyed it. He remembers his mother burning it in the garden after the father died. And what's interesting is that person has described to me how the family, in the years subsequent when they moved to Canberra, they had UFO visitations at the family home. And he's a bit embarrassed about talking about it because he's a very, very senior, former retired federal police officer who thinks, got to be strong about this sort of stuff. But they were completely freaked out, the family, by UFO craft flying over the family home that he and his sister saw. And I confirmed this with his sister. And what's interesting to me is there was a cover-up on Westall, and I suspect that somewhere deep in the archives of the Defence Department there is an as yet unreleased Department of Supply file that has never come within cooee of the National Archives, because the National Archives in Australia are good people, and the way it works, contrary to FOI, there is a presumption of release after 30 years with National Archives documents. And so I went and spoke at the National Archives about the UFO mystery, and they were really lovely people. And one of the people who was running the archives at the time was a former head of IT for ASIO, which is one of our intelligence services. And we went for dinner, and I explained that I was trying to find this file that had been written, this report that had been written about Westall, and he was great. He deployed his staff to try and find out about it, and basically its existence is denied, or knowledge thereof is denied by the Defence Department. But as I've learned from previous investigations, you don't know what you can't find. And there's an enormous amount of data that has never been categorised or catalogued inside the Defence Department that was handed over by the Department of Supply when it was made defunct after Maralinga and Woomera, and just put into the darkest archives of the Defence Department. It's never been catalogued. And I've spoken to people who've told me they've seen some of these files physically sitting on shelves inside the Defence Department. And it's so frustrating because I've literally given the location of some of these shelves to people in the National Archives, and they've told me there's nothing there that pertains to this. And so either it's a cover-up or a cock-up. I always assume a cock-up before a conspiracy, and it's a bit like the Raiders of the Lost Ark, There's probably a Lost Ark of the Covenant sitting on a shelf in the Defence Department somewhere in the US, a la Indiana Jones. And there's this secret Westall report that I know for a fact was written.
It had to have been. And I think when you think about as well that maybe like private aerospace or intelligence agencies are exempt from freedom of information, that report may be sitting somewhere there that essentially can't be accessed because they don't need to be able to release it.
A lot of the time we assume, I was guilty of this in my youth as a journalist, I'd always see a conspiracy, whereas 9 times out of 10, it's a cock-up. And I think with the UFO mystery, a lot of it is a cock-up. I think what happened is the Defence Department during the Cold War, in a well-meaning way, in a benevolent way, it took the view that what had been recovered at Roswell, Aztec, Kingman and other UFO retrievals was so sensitive, so explosive, there was such a serious risk of UFO information leaking to the Soviets. They were terrified of this leaking out like it did with the nuclear bomb, with Klaus Fuchs giving the secrets to the Russians. And so I can understand, I'm not making excuses for them, but I can understand that rationale during the Cold War that it was decided that this should be kept secret. and that the president should sign an executive order that keeps it even away from Congress, because those bloody politicians won't keep their mouths shut. And you can just see how they thought that through in the Cold War. But we're in a post-Cold War era. And more importantly, that secrecy is what is undermining our ability to understand that technology. That's what's been explained to me. And so it's a cock-up. It's literally a concatenation of stupid decisions made by Cold War bureaucrats that we're now trapped in. And so you've got individuals at the CIA who are thinking, oh, this is doing my head in. The last thing I want is have to reveal to Congress that we've been lying to them for 60 or 70 years. Let's just bury this for another 20 years. It's too hard. I don't want to be here when this comes out. And I honestly think that's what's going on.
Last year, Christopher Sharp released an article about the Ocean Crash Retrieval Program, which the CIA of Operations was involved in, the Underwater Reconnaissance Office.
Yep.
They've got, US Naval Research involved as well. And something that was interesting about that article on the first edit is there was a map that included the offices of naval research around the world. And one of them was actually based in Melbourne, Australia there. And that was deleted for the second edit. Now, I wanted to ask, given that that area is actually very close to the Bass Triangle, where there have been disappearances of craft and vessel, and most famously Frederick Valentich in 1978, have you heard anything about the Office of Naval Research being involved with potential crash retrieval programs in Australian waters?
Not in Australian waters, no.
Okay.
I'd be looking a little further south.
Okay, interesting.
I'm told a lot of this is happening in Antarctica.
Okay.
And funnily enough, the best evidence of this came from those guys using that app. I've forgotten the name of the app. But it was a hilarious story where Special Forces soldiers were posting on a publicly available app how well they were doing in their runs in the middle of Antarctica. Why were Joint Special Operations operatives running around a place that didn't exist in the middle of Antarctica? And their exercise watches were logging the latitude and longitude of this particular... It's hilarious. It's a great bit of research done by a young guy in the US. Actually, no, it was a guy in Canberra.
Okay.
It was a young fella in Canberra who did the story. And he picked up on the fact that these exercise watch apps were revealing the existence of some kind of secret American base in Antarctica. I don't know what's going on in Antarctica, but I am persuaded that the Americans are up to something in Antarctica. And it may simply be something as simple as, we're just making sure the Russians don't take over the area. I've got no idea, but could it be UAP related?
It's interesting you said that, because I think I remember in Plain Sight, Bob Fish spoke about the electromagnetic signal associated with UFOs that they might be able to track going in and out of the ocean, and most often coming from the poles, potentially as well.
Interesting, isn't it?
It's very intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew. It's totally speculative, the Antarctica stuff. Linda Moulton Howe ran a story a few years ago where she interviewed some guys who claimed to be American pilots who flew into the American base in Antarctica. And they were claiming that there were parts of Antarctica that are no-fly zones, that you can't fly over, and that you're told you can't fly over them. And I spoke to a friend of mine who's a New Zealand pilot who flies from the New Zealand Christchurch base to McMurdo Sound for deliveries for the New Zealand Antarctic Survey. And he just went, oh, Ross, that's bullshit. No, that's not true. More recently, it's been suggested to me that there are areas that he didn't even know about.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm getting increasingly interested in Antarctica.
Okay.
But I've never seen any evidence at all that the Office of Naval Research or the US Department of Naval Intelligence has any operations in Australia.
Okay. There's an Australian pseudonym assigned to someone called the Grey Man in Diana Pasolka's book Encounters. And it seems as if almost his work is similar in nature to another character mentioned in Diana Pasolka's books,
Tim
Tyler D. Yes, Tim Taylor. Can you speak to anything about the nature of their work, if it is similar, and if there is a relationship?
Not that I can reveal publicly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's under wraps.
Yeah. I've got a hunch as to who it is. Well, I know who it is. And I can understand why she's keeping it confidential. It's there's no nefarious reason for it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting story.
Okay, fascinating. I think probably the final question I want to ask is, we've seen the UAP Disclosure Fund pushing the narrative to try and get disclosure in the United States. Here in Australia, we know that the government has their head in the sand. We've seen Penny Wong's response on that before as well. And it just seems like we're 20 years behind where the US is right now.
Sure.
What can we do in Australia to try and push the needle forward?
What you're doing.
Okay.
Popularising the issue, making the public aware that this is not a subject to be stigmatized or ridiculed. One of the things I find fascinating is there is very clearly an attempt by intelligence agencies around the world to control the public narrative on UFOs. It's not some accident. It's not some vestigial remnant of attitudes that existed 40 or 50 years ago. This is an ongoing attempt to gag the public's knowledge of the UAP issue. What interests me, though, is the tyranny of the internet. The fact that you and I can create shows that are independent of mainstream media. And in my case, I'm not being arrogant about this. I am blown away by the level of interest. I seem to have tapped into a public engagement with an issue that I didn't know was there. I've been completely taken by surprise with the level of engagement and interest on this subject. Some of the stuff that I've posted even in recent weeks has reached 4.5 million views in just 2 weeks. All over the world, there are audiences far larger than, say, the show that I used to work for, 60 Minutes. You know, if they got 500,000 views under the old rating systems, they were happy. They're lucky if they get that these days. Not being arrogant about it, but the UAP subject is drawing millions of people from all over the world who just don't buy the cover-up. And they're moving from mainstream media to non-mainstream media outlets like mine and yours to get their information. Instagram, TikTok, that's where the change is happening. And what's infuriating the US is they can't control it. That's why I think they want to control social media. They're shocked at the way that social media is taking the X and the millennial generation down burrows that, frankly, they want concealed. I mean, some of the most interesting and effective journalism of recent years has been journalism that has, for example, exposed the lies of the reason why we went to a war in Iraq. Most people still to this day have no idea that the basis upon which we deployed to Iraq and got involved in a 20-year war in both Iraq and Afghanistan was on a misguided, false claim that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That was a lie, and they knew it was a lie. During the COVID, we were told that masks and COVID vaccines were absolutely essential to protect us and that these were safe vaccines that were delivering as a protection. That was a lie, and they knew it was a lie. And the best journalism that's been revealing that has come from non-mainstream media. In fact, the mainstream media colluded in the cover-up, as they are on UAPs. And it's basically because what's happened is not some dark conspiracy. It's not the CIA walking into the offices of the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian newspaper and saying, "You shall not publish this." It's firstly a vestigial remnant taboo and stigma attached to the subject of UFOs. It's also the fact that these organisations that once used to have rivers of gold of advertising revenue, they don't have that money anymore. The truth is, investigative journalism in mainstream media is derisively underfunded. When the budget cutting happens in newspapers and television, the first things that get cut are investigative journalism. I have been working on this one story, UFOs, as an investigative journalist now for nearly 8 years. And it's making me a living, God knows why, but I'm pleased it is. Just. The thing that fascinates me is, as a journalist at 60 Minutes, one of the world's most well-resourced public affairs program, if I had 3 weeks to investigate an issue, I was lucky. That's the issue. The issue is that the business model of classified advertising revenue derived journalism that essentially drove public agendas and influenced public opinion is now woefully underfunded to deal with what is the biggest secret of our time. And this is where the tyranny of the internet comes in, the delightful anarchy of the internet, that people like myself can fund themselves, which is what I am doing at considerable cost, to do these investigations. I am not, as so many intelligence trolls suggest on the internet, a UFO grifter making millions of dollars out of covering this subject. I am seriously in hock for covering this subject. But the reason why I'm doing it is because I happen to think it's the most important subject I've ever covered. And at the same time that millions of people are gravitating to my coverage of this subject, which I hope doesn't sound arrogant, mainstream media is constantly dying. And I can't wait for it to die. I want to put a stake through the heart of mainstream media because it has failed, singularly failed, to cover some of the most important issues of our time in recent years. And the reason why is because it took its eye off the ball. And the biggest story that should be being covered, and history will record this as an egregious failure by the mainstream media, is the UFO subject. It allowed itself to be manipulated. It allowed itself to be disinformed. It giggled its way to blind ignorance.
This may be the subject that breaks it, and I hope it is.
I bloody well hope so. Let's put a stake through its heart.
It's a great way to end.
Thanks, Rhys.
Thanks, Roscoe. I appreciate it, mate.
No problem.
Cheers.